In 1804, the Serbian Revolution erupted in Ottoman-controlled Serbia. When the revolution began, its goal was not initially national revolutionary, but rather reformist. The original demand of the revolutionaries was simply for the reinstatement of a benevolent governor. But eventually, the revolt would transform into a national movement, leading to Serbian autonomy. At this time, the Serb movement was largely ignored by the rest of Europe since they were occupied with Napoleon. The revolution would end in 1812, and in 1815, the Serbs would gain limited autonomy. Milos Obrenović, one of the leaders of the revolution, was recognized by the Ottoman Sultan as Supreme Knez, or Prince, in Serbia. Following this victory by the Serbs, important socio-economic events would take place. Firstly, former Ottoman land was expropriated during this time by the locals. Secondly, under the rule of Obrenović, Serbia essentially became his personal despotate. After years of poor rule and mismanagement, Obrenović faced an ultimatum from both the Russian Tsar and the Ottoman Sultan. He was told to create a constitution that gave important government powers to an advisory council. In 1838, this decree would be enacted over his head by his Ottoman overlords. Afterwards, he abdicated and went into voluntary exile. His son, Milan Obrenović II, would succeed him, but he died less than a year into his reign. Milos's other child, Mihailo Obrenović, would then ascend the throne at the age of 17. He would reign for 3 years before he himself was deposed and replaced with Alexander Karađorđević, the son of George Petrovich, who had been killed by Mihailo's father Milos. During this time, in the 1840s, Serbia was essentially ruled by the bureaucracy. But unfortunately for Serbia, Alexander proved to be a weak and ineffective ruler. In a court divided between Eastern and Western sympathizers, he was unable to secure the support of either. In 1858, a National Assembly, which was dominated by Western-oriented liberals, decided to call Milos back from exile so that he could rule once more. Milos reigned for only 2 years and was once more succeeded by his son, Mihailo, or Michael. Under Michael's reign, Ottoman troops were completely removed from Serbia, and it became de facto independent for the first time. Michael proved to be the king which the Serbian bureaucracy was looking for. But after only 8 years of rule, Michael would be assassinated. It is around this time that the socialist movement first takes root in Serbia. But we must first take note of the socio-economic structure of Serbia. Serbia in 1850 was a land dominated by its rural peasantry. Out of a population of around 1 million, it is said that 90% were peasants. During the period when Serbia was under Turkish rule, the population of its cities were almost exclusively foreigners, Turks, Greeks, Magyars, Germans, etc. But after Serbia gained autonomy within the empire, the towns became more Serbian in composition. Within this mass of peasants existed a small middle class, merchants, craftsmen, and traders, and other entrepreneurial petty bourgeois elements, as well as an even smaller class of intelligentsia, lawyers, doctors, teachers, etc. The growth of an educated class in Serbia was slow. By 1875, the literacy rate was still only between 5 and 10%. Serbia did not have any higher level institutions of learning than its one singular high school in Belgrade. If students wanted to acquire higher education, they needed to go abroad. This is important because when these knowledge seekers returned, they would come back with new ideas, revolutionary democratic, nationalist, and even socialist ideas. Now, despite the small size of the burgeoning Serbian bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie, these classes and the bureaucracy effectively controlled Serbian economic and political life. These elements constituted the Serbian bureaucracy and levied ever-increasing tax burdens on the rural peasant masses. It was because of this exploitation of the peasantry that in the 1870s, middle-class reformers began to adopt and espouse socialist ideals of the agrarian kind. Even as late as 1870, autonomous Serbia did not have a real proletariat to speak of. In the 1870s, while countries like England and the USA were industrializing, Serbia was just now accomplishing what had been taking place in countries like the Netherlands in the 1600s. In fact, according to Woodford McClellan, Serbia had only one factory worthy of the name in 1875. The object of exploitation instead was the peasantry, whose way of life was being upended by the economic shifts taking place, i.e., by primitive accumulation. The Serbian peasantry had, under Turkish rule, lived in zadrugas, extended family communes that were governed by patriarchs. In these communes, everything was held in common, and the ruling patriarch would typically make all the decisions. These familial units were quite isolated, but they were also self-sufficient. So as a result, it was quite unnecessary for them to make contact with anyone else. However, after Serbia achieved autonomy, land that was previously owned by Turks was being expropriated. The chifliks had been abolished, and by 1840, all of the land owned by Turks had been seized and redistributed to the peasants. In the first few years of the new prince's reign, the new land was cheap, so many Zadruga dwellers had left in order to build their own farms. And at the same time, Bosnian Serbs were migrating to take advantage of free land tax benefits offered by the state. However, these ignorant peasants with their new land quickly found themselves getting fleeced by merchants and usurers, and then digging themselves into large, inescapable debts. Following the shift from Turkish dominance to Serb dominance in the cities, the existing industries began to change as well. The fez-making industry disappeared, and manufactured goods were being imported from Austria. It would take until 1910 for the system of guilds to be completely abolished via capitalism's further development. As a consequence of an influx of foreign capital and the eventual growth of a local bourgeois class, the Serbian economy transitioned from an in-kind economy to a monetary one. Thus, taxation now also had to be paid monetarily rather than with goods. Therefore, the Serbian peasantry could no longer be self-sufficient. They no longer produced for themselves, but instead for the market. They labored so that they might be able to turn a profit and pay off their debts. As parvenus, the peasants had trouble competing with small farmers. Following the typical pattern of capitalist development, many peasants began to become urban city dwellers and found work in crafts industries. The growth of the centralized bureaucracy also completely destroyed the traditional local self-governments that existed for centuries prior. These peasants had lived on rural communes, or obština, which were basically the same as the Russian obshina. These communes were self-managed. They operated with town meetings and democratic management. But soon the state began to displace these communities as it exerted more control over its domain. The situation of the peasantry was quite disheartening, but typical in history. As McClellan writes, thus, the peasants, a class of small proprietors with strong, if increasingly repressed traditions of communal autonomy, had by the early 1870s been driven to a point of economic and political exasperation. Proud of the fact that he had driven the hated Turk from his land, the Serbian peasant was perplexed by the lack of freedom he had under a government of his own countrymen. His land was less securely his own than in Turkish times. His taxes were higher, his government more obtrusive into his affairs. To the peasant, it seemed that he had indeed exchanged one set of masters for another, and in many respects, the new masters were worse than the old, for they were of his own kind. It was under these conditions that the socialist movement first developed in Serbia. Much credit can be given to the work and struggle of Serbia's first genuine socialist, Svetozar Marković. But this early socialist movement was influenced by and large by the Russian revolutionary movement and the agrarian conditions inherent in Serbian society. It was a Narodnik-type agrarian socialism, a populist radicalism. In 1881, after his death, Marković's followers would found the Narodna Radikalna Stranka, the People's Radical Party, or NRS, a party which would later become a nationalist party, following the failure of the Timok Rebellion, and in the future, they would struggle against the socialists. It would not be until 1903 that the Serbian Social Democratic Party, a socialist party subscribing specifically to Marxism, would emerge in Serbia. When the First World War broke out, the Serbian Social Democrats were the only ones in Europe that did not vote in favor of granting war credits to their belligerent government. In Croatia, we find a different story, but one which I'll expand less on. Croatia and the Northern Balkans had been under Habsburg control for almost 400 years. Before then, Croatia had been under the rule of Hungary since the 12th century. But the Austrians came to rule Croatia directly following the election of Austrian King Ferdinand I to the Croatian throne in 1527. In later centuries, the Ottomans reached the zenith of their empire and then entered their centuries-long period of decline. As the Ottomans began to falter, the Habsburgs encroached further into the Balkans, politically and territorially. The city of Rijeka in Croatia was declared as a free port in 1719. As a city situated on the Adriatic coast, it would be of great economic and industrial importance for Croatia. In the years following, the city would create some early industrial enterprises, such as a sugar refinery and a paper mill. However, throughout Croatia, the largest industrial enterprise was woodworking. Wood would be used for the construction of ships for the Rijeka port, or for inland vessels like carts, wagons, etc., to be used for the interior. Modern industrial machinery would appear in Croatia in the 19th century. Mills based off of Western design began to pop up all across Croatia, such as in 1849, 1850, and 1860, when steam-powered sawmills were constructed in Prizren, Cherni Lug, and Ravna Gora, respectively. Full-on factories began to appear in the latter half of the 1800s as well. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, a workers' movement would spawn in Croatia and Slovenia. In 1872, Zagreb workers founded the Craftsmen's and Workers' Society. This society worked as an educational institution and had its own library, but also gave support to workers, such as by paying for health benefits and for funerals of workers who died. By 1874, this society was publishing its own newspaper, Radnički Prijatelja, the workers' friend. However, when this paper ceased publication, Karlo Držaić states that the workers' movement in Croatia and Slavonije died down, but it would flare up again in the 1880s. While Serbia's socialist movement had been Russian-influenced, the Croatian and Slavonian workers' movement was largely influenced by the Austrians and the Germans, due in part to the fact that a portion of the new workers arriving in the region were of German origin. The Croatian socialists, thus, in the beginning, were largely influenced by the Austrian Social Democrats. They would even adopt their view on the national question in relation to the Habsburg Empire's national minorities. It would be in Croatia that the first genuinely Slavic Marxist Socialist Party was founded in 1894. This party was the Socijaldemokratska stranka Hrvatske I Slavonije, or Social Democratic Party of Croatia and Slavonia, SDSHIS. As Croatia's industry would develop, this party would grow congruently. When Croatia and also Slovenia would join Yugoslavia, they would represent its most highly developed regions, even after World War II. The concept of a South Slav nation had been around since the 19th century. This concept would hold much sway over the Croat, Serb, and Slovene intelligentsias. The dreams of these intellectuals came to fruition with the Corfu Declaration in 1917, and the subsequent foundation of the new South Slav state in 1918. In the aftermath of the First World War, old empires were dismembered and destroyed. After the defeat of the Central Powers, Poland and Czechoslovakia became independent. Romania swallowed up the eastern territory of the Habsburg Empire, and in the Balkans, where the whole imperialist war first initiated, Serbia found itself the leader of a huge swath of the Balkan Slavs. The Croats, the Slovenes, and the Bosnians, previously under the Germanic banner of the House of Habsburg, were now under the Serbian banner of the Karađorđević dynasty. All of these people and more combined to form this new nation, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, a nation later dubbed as Yugoslavia, a nation which, as we have shown, was from the outset economically and culturally divided between East and West, North and South, Austrian hegemony and Ottoman yoke, split amongst Catholics, Muslims, and the Orthodox, between those who read the Latin script and those who used Cyrillic. This new country, as a nation of many divisions, it was a hotbed for insurrection and political instability. Therefore, it was ripe for revolution. In the early days of the nation, the situation was further exacerbated by the collapse of large companies in the more industrialized nations of Slovenia and Croatia. This economic uncertainty, coupled with peasant struggles occurring in the countryside, created a scenario that was perfect for communist agitation. The socialists of Serb heritage would come together with Austro-Croat and Slovene socialists to form the new workers' movement in a country where economic development was highly uneven. In this new kingdom, out of all the nations that comprised the entity, it was the Serbs who were in the majority. Out of a population of some 16 million, 6 million were Serbian. The nation's capital, its government, the administrative and financial institutions of this kingdom were all located in Serbia. This fact played an important role in the development of the communist movement in Yugoslavia, especially concerning the proper position to take on the national question, a position which evolved over the years. The new socialist workers' movement that emerged in Yugoslavia culminated in the founding of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia at a Belgrade conference in 1919. This party was originally called the Socialist Workers' Party of Yugoslavia, Communist, and it was created from a merger of the various local social democratic parties in Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, etc. into one national, one Yugoslav unit. The first leader of this new party was Filip Filipović, who was Serbian. Now, just like every communist party that has ever existed, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia immediately found itself engaged in a factional struggle on many questions, such as top-down centralization, regional federalism, and perhaps most importantly, the imminence of revolution in the new kingdom. And for example, in the new party program, the line that was being pushed called for, quote, immediate struggle for the dictatorship of the proletariat in the form of a Soviet republic, establishment of a popular Red Army, and expropriation of the bourgeoisie. According to Ivo Banac, there were two trends within Yugoslav socialism that were united when this party formed, those being Sloveno-Croat philo-Bolshevism on one end, a trend which was in part influenced by the Pelagičists, which were those Austro-Hungarian POWs who were returning from Soviet Russia, and, on the other end, Serbo-Bosnian doctrinaire and Orthodox Marxism. In other words, you had Northwestern Leninists on one side and Central Eastern Kautskyists on the other. But the initial unity that the party had obviously wouldn't last long, especially since the leftists were in the majority from the very beginning. The first act of dominance by the left was showed at the party's second Congress when they renamed the party to the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. The KPJ left occupied the total majority of the party and went quite unopposed. When the Croatian centrists refused to accept the new party program and refused to hand over control of the party newspaper and treasury to the left majority, they were simply expelled from the party in July of 1920. As the KPJ grew and developed its stance on various questions, more divisions and splits would occur beyond the initial Leninist-Kautsky split. As we previously mentioned, Yugoslavia was already on the brink from the moment it was created, and the Communist Party, from its foundation, were already preparing for an uprising which would have occurred only a few months after the party was founded. One of the reasons for the boldness on the part of the Yugoslav communist conspirators was the recent coming to power of Bela Kun and the communists in Hungary. Kun and the communists created a Soviet republic along the northern border of Yugoslavia in March of that year. The leader of the KPJ, Filipović, traveled to Soviet Hungary to discuss plans for a revolution in Yugoslavia. The man who would become the link between Soviet Hungary and the Yugoslav communists was one Afera Diamantstein. Diamantstein had been hired as a courier by Soviet Hungary to transport funds and agitprop to the Yugoslav communists. Diamantstein, as far as I know, wasn't exactly a communist and certainly not a revolutionary, but he was getting paid to do his job, and so he did. The KPJ, still going by SRPJ at this time, formulated its plan to launch a revolution in Yugoslavia. As I understand it, the uprising was planned to take place on July 21st. Communications were formed with a Croatian army officer named Josip Metzger. Contact was made with him by Vladimir Ćopić, a name which you should remember. At this time, Ćopić was in jail, but regardless, he and other conspirators formulated plans for an uprising. Metzger received money and weapons from Soviet Hungary through Diamantstein. It was Metzger's job to spark the uprising in Croatia, while the communists operated around the kingdom and near the border of Soviet Hungary. The Communist Party began setting up Red Guard detachments, collecting weapons, and agitating amongst workers and the French army soldiers stationed in the kingdom. On July 21st, a general strike in support of Soviet Russia and Soviet Hungary erupted, while small armed uprisings broke out throughout the country. But these mini Red Guard uprisings were put down by the army very quickly. The police would manage to arrest Diamantstein, who, while in custody, revealed quite literally everything about the uprising to the police. Diamantstein gave them names, addresses, possible members, and even his own secret code. Armed with this new information, the police would raid communist hideouts and arrest dozens more communists in August. Despite this rather huge setback, all but 8 people who were put on trial for conspiracy would soon be acquitted. All of the arrested kept their mouths shut and did not say a single word about their illegal organization, meaning that all the allegations could be pinned on just one person, Diamantstein. A year later, in what was meant to be a high-profile trial, only 3 people were charged, and their prison sentences were short. Of the sentences that were passed, none were any longer than 1 year, and the rest were simply let go. Now, while the details are rather murky, the plot certainly existed. It is not up for debate. The state simply just did not have the means to prove that a plot did exist, and therefore could not prosecute the people which they had on trial. In the end, the state made a fool of themselves, and the communists went on to continue their activities, both legal and illegal. The KPJ was not even banned or repressed. They were still allowed even to participate in the 1920 election next year. And in that election in November of 1920, the KPJ did not do horribly. In fact, they did quite well for a communist party during its first election. Out of over 17 participating parties, the KPJ received around 200,000 votes out of a total of 1.6 million. The KPJ then got around 12.4% of the vote and gained 58 seats in parliament. Now, to understand this election, we must keep in mind that the Yugoslav state was an amalgamation of nations. And therefore, the political parties that existed were not Yugoslav parties, but Croat, Slovene, or Serb parties. Parties that existed represented the national interest of a specific national group, rather than Yugoslav society as a whole. So while the KPJ attempted to appeal to all facets of Yugoslav society, a given party might only appeal to its core group, and therefore win the larger part of that group. It is for this reason that in Croatia, despite its large class of proletarians, that the KPJ was outperformed by the Croatian Peasant Party, or HSS. The HSS would receive 230,000 votes in the first election. but at the same time it gained less seats in the Constitutional Assembly than the Communists. We find the same story occurring in Slovenia. Here, the Slovene People's Party would gain nearly 60,000 votes and 14 seats. The Yugoslav Muslim organization would get 100,000 votes, for a total of 6% of the vote and 24 seats. The Serbian People's Radical Party received a little over 280,000 votes, or 17.7% of the vote. Thus, because of the peculiarities of Yugoslav society, the capacity of the communists to gain a more astounding electoral success was mitigated by the national differentiation of the new state. Despite the decent success that this party had achieved in its first year, it would be banned not even 1 year later. This happened because 1 month after the election, the communists led strikes across the country. These strikes closed important mines in Slovenia and Bosnia, but the government acted quickly, and with soldiers, they suppressed the strikes. Following the failure of the strikes, the state began to suppress KPJ newspapers. They raided and shut down their offices. In response to this government suppression, young communists acting on their own initiative began making attempts at assassinating government officials. And the two most notable of these was the failed assassination attempt on the king regent Alexander and the successful attempt on Milorad Drasković, who was the former minister of the interior. Drasković was killed by Alija Alijagić, a Bosnian member of the KPJ-affiliated terrorist organization Zverna Pravda, Red Truth, in July 1921. The party, which by then had at least 50,000 members, was now forced underground and would eventually be reduced to less than 1,000 active members. From here, the party would embark on a long, very slow, and quite rocky road to recovery. Ironically, but characteristically, even in this devastated state, the party was still wrought with factional struggle. It would be split between a right faction and a left faction. Alongside these two main factions were also some smaller subgrouplets and an ultra-left minority. The right faction would be led by Sima Marković, Lazar Stevanović, and Sivota Milošević, all of whom were Serbian socialists who had been active in Serbia's small trade union movement. Marković, in fact, had previously been an anarcho-syndicalist. The KPJ right firmly believed that the party could work to regain the trust of the government and become legal once more. Furthermore, since the party was in such a dilapidated state, they believed that this path was the necessary one to take so that the party might regain a mass following. The KPJ right therefore advocated working through legal channels and in the trade union movement to help in rebuilding that mass following. The KPJ left was led by Đuro Savić, Vladimir Chopić, Kosta Novaković, Trisha Kaklerović, and Rajko Jovanović. To the left were the intransigents, Ante Siliga and Dragutin Gustincic. There was also the Klemencic-Fabiancic group, a small little faction in favor of Yugoslav federalism, led by two prominent Slovenians. This group called themselves the True Communists. They would leave and rejoin the KPJ multiple times, but eventually they were just expelled. Despite being leftists themselves, they more often than not were criticizing the left wing of the party. The KPJ left, as you might expect, had the complete opposite view of the right. They favored maintaining the illegal struggle as the best thing to do in light of the circumstances that they found themselves in. They opposed the right's liquidationism and wished to continue the party's underground revolutionary activity. Most of the support for the left faction would come from Croatia. Josip Broz and his partner at the time, Andrija Hebrang, were also on the left, and also Croatian. However, they followed a different path in regard to the national question, which was a matter of great contention and division amongst each of the factions. Originally, the social democratic position in Slovenia, Croatia, and Serbia on the South Slav question was that there was no real difference between Slovenes, Croats, or Serbs. These groups were what they called the three named peoples, meaning that they were simply three tribes who comprised one nation. This idea of Yugoslav unitarism was practically uniform in South Slavic social democracy. When the Social Democrats later became communists, they would eventually adopt a new position, one which was greatly influenced by Bolshevism. They now believed that each group of the South Slavic peoples actually constituted a different nation and deserved autonomy within a unified entity. The Yugoslav communists, contrary to most other communists, and the Comintern itself, viewed the Yugoslav state as a progressive entity and initially supported unitarism and Yugoslavism. The South Slavic socialists had spoken of creating a sort of Balkan federation for years. The creation of this federation would represent a progressive step towards establishing socialism. The Yugoslav idea, thus, became strongly supported by the South Slavic socialists as the method by which to solve the national question, but also a means to progress the struggle for socialism in the Balkans. According to Paul Shoup, the national question in the KPJ was initially treated with little regard. According to Shoup, It was only after the 1920 elections that the KPJ's aloofness, as he called it, to this question would change. Pressure from the Comintern was the cause. Paul Shoup writes, "For a period of 3 years, until May of 1922, there was no public criticism of the Yugoslav Party's national policy by the Communist International, and the CPY was permitted to pursue its policy of aloofness from the growing national dispute in Yugoslavia without interference from Moscow. But it was clear that from its inception, the Comintern had a view on the national question which was contrary to the position of the Yugoslav communists, reflecting the hostility of the Soviet Union to the Versailles settlement. The Comintern was openly critical of the formation of Yugoslavia, and saw in growing national rivalries the opportunity to strike a blow against the new state. In the following years, the Yugoslav Communist Party would flip-flop between publishing left or right views, leading to a great deal of confusion amongst the rank and file. When the left of the party became dominant in late 1923, the party would switch its position on the national question into one that was in conformity with the Comintern line. The KPJ then, therefore, became staunchly opposed to Yugoslavism and to unitarism. The new line pushed by the party called for the right of self-determination and for the liberation of various national entities within Yugoslavia from great Serbianism, which disguised itself as Yugoslavism. Prior to this point, and when the split originally emerged, the left of the KPJ were those who favored the federalist stance, while the right, on the other hand, were the centralists. Marković, for example, was staunchly opposed to the Comintern line, but for Marković this question was not just a tactical one. He opposed the Comintern line principally on an ideological level as well. Marković felt that the Comintern position was a flagrant violation of Marxist principles. Marković and the KPJ right had regarded the matter of nationality entirely differently from the left. The left felt that the national question could only be solved within a socialist framework and through a revolution. The right felt that it was a bourgeois question that could be solved constitutionally. In 1923, during what Paul Shoup called the height of the controversy over the national question in Yugoslavia, Marković would write 2 texts on his position. Those texts were The National Question in the Light of Marxism and The Constitutional Question in the Working Class of Yugoslavia. Shoup summarizes Marković's work in this manner. Basing his analysis primarily on the pre-World War I works of Stalin, Marković sought theoretical justification for his personal conviction that the national question was not one which the party could exploit for revolutionary ends. In this vein, Marković argued that nationalism originated with the bourgeoisie and that the reconciliation of national conflicts should be sought within a capitalist framework. If not, the class struggle would remain stillborn, overshadowed by the demagogic appeals of competing national groups. Marković took the position that Yugoslavia was no exception to this general rule, that the people of the country desired union, and that, for this reason, the solution of the national question lay in finding a form of state organization most likely to reconcile conflicting national interests. In words which were to become the focus of the controversy, he stated that the national question was for the present a constitutional question. Even though the left won out in the 1923 debates and discussions on the questions of nationality would continue. These discussions would eventually reach the Comintern itself when Marković came into conflict with Comintern executives at the 5th plenum in spring of 1925. Marković was attacked by both Zinoviev and Stalin, who fought against his thesis that the Yugoslav national question could be solved constitutionally. Shoup alleges that when Marković revealed his analysis was based off of Stalin's writings, that the argument shifted from how to maneuver the party in the actually extant conditions in the Balkans to a dispute over the proper Marxist approach to the matter of nationality in general. Still, despite his fight, Marković's position in the party and in the Comintern would not win. Very much like the original split in 1920, these new divisions on tactical considerations were based on a different analysis of the present situation. The left viewed the revolution as being imminent, around the corner, and thus, with this view, they justified their aggressive stance. The right were more pessimistic, however. They had no belief that any uprising would or could occur anytime soon, and thus pursued a cautious conciliatory policy. The respective views of each faction determined the course in which they believed that the party should take. As the party shifted between left and right, new party proclamations would contradict and override previous statements that were made. In 1923, when the party formed a legal front organization, the Independent Workers' Party of Yugoslavia, all that was truly accomplished was the revelation of all the factional divisions plaguing the party to the public eye. In 1924, much as in 1920 and 1923, the left won over the right in the party yet again. Therefore, the pro-Comintern Federalists won over the Unitarists. This victory coincided with increased Comintern pressure on the KPJ to work alongside national movements. The leader of the Croatian Peasant Party, Stepan Radić, traveled to the Soviet Union and applied to enter his party into the Comintern, which was basically the peasant version of the Comintern. Radić was looking for international allies in support of his struggle in Yugoslavia, and the USSR, which was seemingly in its pro-peasant phase in the mid-1920s, was the perfect source for such support. Radic's visit, therefore, influenced the Comintern's policy in Yugoslavia even further, and the KPJ was advised to express in its Declaration of the Right of Nations to Self-Determination explicitly that the Croatian, Slovene, and all the other nations comprising Yugoslavia had the right to be independent entities. In the pages of the Comintern newspaper, Radić attacked the Serb communists of the KPJ and then taunted them by saying that, quote, "It is only natural that the Croatian workers and the majority of the members of the Yugoslav Communist Party came over and enlisted in our ranks, where they remain today." When Radić returned to Yugoslavia, he was arrested, and the anti-communist laws that were applied to the KPJ extended to his party as well. Because of this, Radić switched his stance. Despite Radic's reversal, the KPJ was still told to keep trying to work with the HSS. But the debacle of Radic's turn caused an upset in the party, specifically with Života Milošević. Debate in the party over the national question would renew, and on November 1924, the KPJ led an internal referendum that repudiated the right-wing unitarists. Only one group in Belgrade supported the former right opposition. By the end of that year, Milošević would be expelled from the KPJ over his continued disagreements with the KPJ party line. Following his expulsion, he immediately formed the Workers' Unity Group and began polemicizing with the KPJ over the Croatian question once more. The KPJ left and the KPJ right had quarreled for over 5 years over various practical and ideological questions. The factional fights were extremely disruptive. They had even caused the party headquarters to switch from the rightist center in Belgrade to the leftist center in Zagreb. The two factions would continue to quarrel for 4 more years on these same questions. For almost a decade, factionalism had completely paralyzed the KPJ. Because of the constant disputes, the party was prevented from actually engaging in any meaningful revolutionary or organizational activity within the working class. It was finally in 1928 that Josip Broz and Andrija Hebrang would convince delegates at the Zagreb Party Organization's 8th Congress to appeal directly to the Comintern to resolve the issue of factionalism in the party. The so-called Zagreb Line was endorsed in an open letter by the Balkan Secretariat. At the 4th Party Congress, the party's leadership was shaken up, and the newest Comintern line was adopted. As the Comintern entered its 3rd period, it needed new leadership to enact its policies. In all of the other international communist parties, that meant that the rightists who were leading the party were removed. But in Yugoslavia, it was the left which had been dominating the party that was pushed to the side. The rightist Sima Marković was expelled, while the leftist Juro Sivić was removed from leadership and replaced with Comintern-trained activists such as Juro Žaković and Jovan Martinović Malesić, 2 people who were both members of the left themselves. But as Comintern activists, they were considered non-factional. With Juro now in the saddle of the KPJ, the new Comintern line on every question was adopted. For example, the new position of the national question was for the complete breakup of the Yugoslav state in its entirety, with the right of secession for every nation. As these shakeups in the party were ongoing, in January 1929, the King of Yugoslavia would enact a royal dictatorship. This came about as a result of the political deadlock between the Serbian and Croatian parties following the assassination of Stepan Radić by a member of the Serbian Radical Party in the summer of 1928. The king's dictatorship annulled the constitution, abolished parliament, and banned all political parties. The king would also officially rename the country from the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia to emphasize unity. National flags were banned, and Croatia was divided into several administrative districts as the Belgrade government attempted to centralize and strengthen itself against national movements. Still, at this point, everything in Yugoslavia was Serb-dominated, so it was hard to present Yugoslavia as a nation representing all Slavs instead of the reality. Thus, instead of assuaging national tension by trying to strong-arm the national question, the king instead just gave more ammunition to national movements. The KPJ thus took the turn of events in Yugoslavia as a further reason to take up that militant action, and so did many other separatist movements in Yugoslavia. The only way out of this crisis for the working class and the peasantry is armed struggle, civil war against the rule of the hegemonistic Serbian bourgeoisie, no parliamentary and democratic combinations, no governments, elections, and pacifist expectations are capable of meeting a single demand of the working class, the peasantry, and the oppressed nationalities. For the working people, there is no solution but armed struggle. The result of the KPJ's adoption of third period tactics was nothing less than a total disaster for the party. The party's new secretary, Gorkić, who had literally just come back to Yugoslavia from the Soviet Union, was killed in an armed confrontation with the police. Later, mass arrests would sweep those few remaining activists that the party had on the ground in Yugoslavia. Now there were only a few hundred active party members in the country, and the party leadership had fled to Austria. Hilda Hauge elucidates the situation further. The KPJ's confrontational attitude towards other anti-regime political forces meant that few organizations would cooperate with them. The KPJ overestimated its own ability to transform support for groups like the HSS into support for communism. Despite, or because of Radic's assassination, the HSS still commanded the overwhelming support of the Croats. Their confrontational line with the Yugoslav government also affected the KPJ command structure, since many of their leaders were imprisoned or killed in clashes with the regime. KPJ's strategies to exploit the national question during this period totally failed and did little to progress their revolutionary aims or to attract the support of nationalist groups to the communist cause. In fact, the KPJ were left even more politically isolated, as well as internally fragmented and weakened. The prisons in which many Yugoslav revolutionaries would find themselves in became training grounds for new cadre. The KPJ had so many of its members in prison that it created its own prison organization called the Kakic. This organization will be dominated for years by Petko Miletić Sepo, a notoriously violent and sectarian communist who had developed somewhat of a cult of personality around himself. His group of followers on the far left of the KPJ were pejoratively called the Wahhabists for their unsophisticated and anti-intellectual extremism. Also because of the new Comintern line, the KPJ began to flirt with Ante Pavelić's Ustasha inside and outside the prisons. Their hope was to steer them left, but as we all know, this did not work. Their attempts at finding common cause with the Ustasha were only reversed when Hitler came to power in 1934, and the third period as a whole came to an end. The shift in Comintern policy led to another shakeup in the KPJ and its leadership. When before they tried to seize mass Croat support from the HSS by denouncing its leadership as agents of Serb imperialism, they now spoke of convincing the HSS to join in a popular front against the fascist royal dictatorship. After 1935, the KPJ communists also ceased calling for the dismantling of the Yugoslav state. They now argued that those who called for its destruction were playing into the hands of fascism. The new line called for support for the continued existence and defense of a Yugoslav entity. They still advocated for the rights of nations to self-determination. Hilda Hauge explains further. Although in previous years, the KPJ had agitated for the breakup of the Yugoslav state as directed by the Comintern, the return to a Yugoslav line did not cause too much disruption in the organization. Not all communists had felt entirely at ease with this policy, which in essence was imposed upon them by the Comintern. Even though the Yugoslav communists had pursued the secessionist and sectarian policy of the Third Comintern with great vigor, even the leftist Yugoslav cadres had, in late 1920, been in favor of some form of federal Yugoslav solution. Despite its otherwise marginal position in Yugoslav politics, the KPJ was the only political force with a network extending throughout the entire Yugoslav state, and not related to one particular national group. Cadres frequently moved around to different regions, and the party was organized on a Yugoslav principle. The fact that the party and its activity was structured in this way meant that advocating secession and the breakup of the Yugoslav state would not be advantageous to the KPJ. Therefore, the support for a Yugoslav line resulted from a combination of new orders from Moscow and a more realistic assessment of the KPJ's revolutionary tactics and strategies, including to its internal position in Yugoslavia and its ability to attract support in the new political context. When the shift from sectarianism to popular frontism did occur, it coincided with the rise of a man who would fundamentally change the party, Josip Brzezinski, better known as Milan Gorkić. While the KPJ and particularly its Croatian membership was staunchly leftist, Gorkić would pursue what we would call a rightist policy. Gorkić was very much the perfect man for the new collaborationist Popular Front policy, as he had no problem working with and making contact with the bourgeois opposition forces, something which greatly irritated the KPJ left. Gorkić's new policy would inevitably bring him into conflict with the left of his party, especially those far-left Wahhabists centered around Miletić in the prisons. But let us go back to 1929 after Đuro's death for one quick second. After Đuro Đaković was killed by the police in 1929, the party leadership would flee to Austria. It would take 3 whole years for the party to recover from this setback. In 1930, Đaković's partner, Martinović Malesić, was sacked as party leader and replaced by Anton Mavrak and Filip Filipović. If you're following along, you can see that the party had now shifted back from the left to the right, and thus, as a result, paved the way for Gorkić's leadership. It'll be in 1932 when Gorkić was appointed as interim party leader. Gorkić, like Đuro before him, was also Comintern trained. In fact, he hadn't been in Yugoslavia for 10 years. Instead, he'd been in the USSR since 1923. However, because of this, he wasn't well liked by most Yugoslav communists, who viewed him as out of touch. but he was the Comintern's guy, and they liked him. Gorkić, as leader, pushed the party further along the right-wing course, which was started by Filipović and Mavrak. Gorkić's line encouraged working in non-communist trade unions, building up support in universities and clubs, and he also advocated for a less hostile and less sectarian attitude towards non-communist socialists. He even permitted Communist Party members to work with the Social Democratic rank and file. What Gorkić was doing was essentially the opposite of what every other Communist Party had been ordered to do during the Third Period. It was also the exact same policy which Lovestone and all the other communist opposition groups had been expelled for. According to Guzvica, the KPJ was, quote, a cautious vanguard of the developments which would be sanctioned by the 7th Congress of the Comintern in August 1935. That is, their party's activities acted as a prelude to the Popular Front policy that became a universal tactic in the mid to late 1930s. But before this was the case, as we previously mentioned, Gorkić was technically moving out of line. The new KPJ party triumvirate in the early 1930s was Milan Gorkić, Blagoje Parović, and Vladimir Čopić. Čopić was one of the old leftists who hated Gorkić. You might ask why then Gorkić would have him in his inner circle. This was a part of Gorkić's conciliatory attitude and his attempts at overcoming factional struggles. But a communist party will always be a communist party, and these factional struggles would still persist in spite of Gorkić's desires. In 1934, at the 4th Land Conference of the KPJ in Ljubljana, the party formed its new Politburo. It consisted of Blagoje Parović, Adolf Muck, Josip Broz, Milan Gorkić, and Kamilo Horvatin. Even though Gorkić moved party practice to the right, he did not stack its leadership with rightists, but rather went for a big tent approach. In his leadership, Horvatin, like Čopić, was also previously a member of the left-wing faction, and many of those other members on his Politburo did not hold views that were perfectly aligned with his. Guzvica writes, at the time, the leadership was seemingly more or less harmonious, and it reflected Gorkić's big tent approach. Muck was the only figure who could truly be described as one of Gorkić's cronies, while Parović was the most consistent promoter of Gorkić's policy on the trade unions and the United Front. Broz had just come out of prison and was uninvolved in doctrinal disputes. Gorkić clearly remembered him as one of the initiators of the 1928 anti-factional line. Čopić was becoming increasingly hostile to Gorkić, while Horvatin, another old member of the party left, did not seem to have any disagreements with the party leader at the time. Although Gorkić's practical policies seemed rightist, nothing about his choice of top party cadres showed a preference for the party's former right wing. At the 4th Conference in 1934, the party abandoned its long-held platform advocating for the liquidation of the Yugoslav state, and now instead promoted national unity in the face of the fascist threat. They did call for an uprising against the fascist Yugoslav state, but did not expressly mention, as they previously did, the dissolution of that state. And in 1935, when the Comintern finally adopted the Popular Front line, the KPJ would openly condemn secession. In 1936, they embraced Yugoslavism even further, and by 1937, the slogan of self-determination disappeared completely from their party program. Despite staunch opposition from the left wing of the party, by 1935, the KPJ under Gorkić's leadership had transformed itself from a small far-left sect into a larger mass movement. Even though Gorkić was successful in reinvigorating the party, the United and later Popular Front in Yugoslavia was not at all successful because the left and progressive forces in the country did not soon forget the KPJ's previous uncompromising sectarianism and thus were highly skeptical of them. The Croats-dominated left also resisted Gorkić's plans to work with the socialists, and one of the reasons for that opposition, according to Paul Shoup, was because their approach to the national question did not treat Croatia as a separate entity. Instead of working with the socialists, the Croatian communists wished to work with the Croatian Peasant Party. Discontent over the Popular Front's failure and the lack of agreement on a particular line would increase day by day within the party. It would be in 1936 at the April plenum of the party in Vienna, one which Gorkić himself was not present at since he was in Moscow, that the left wing would make their discontent known and reignite the factional struggles. The party was now split between the Gorkićevci, who were the Big Tent majority comprised of leftists and rightists, against the left of the party, led by Vladimir Čopić, among others. The pretext specifically used for the left's attack on Gorkić was a series of arrests that had occurred in 1935. Because of these arrests, many KPJ members, including some of Gorkić's own supporters, began to criticize his handling of the party's conspirational work. But according to Guzvica, the real grievance and primary cause for the left's attack was Gorkić's implementation of the Popular Front strategy. When Gorkić pushed to legalize the party and create ties with the non-communist opposition to the royal dictatorship, he was accused by the left of liquidationism. With this charge, the KPJ left was essentially calling Gorkić a Menshevik and an anti-Leninist. The left blamed the 1935 mass arrests on Gorkić's attempts at legalizing the party. They would also further accuse Gorkić of attempting to form a third group, which amounted to a faction, and thus would be in violation of Comintern policy. Gorkić caved at the results of the party plenum, and he was forced to self-criticize. Seemingly victorious, the new triumvirate was comprised of Mavrak, Čopić, and Hudemalj. At this point, Gorkić's career would have ended, but much like with Thälmann in Germany, he was saved by the Comintern, more specifically, his associate Manuelski. Stefan Guzvica writes, "The Comintern reacted furiously to the decision of the April plenum, not least because they had not been notified or consulted in any way. Gorkić's Comintern patrons were intent on preserving his domination over the KPJ, as he enjoyed their utmost trust, unlike the majority of the Yugoslavs they had worked with. They therefore summoned a series of meetings of the ECCI Secretariat in Moscow in August and September, at which the decisions of the April plenum were to be critically reassessed. Although the official line was that both sides of the conflict were to blame, the consultation in Moscow was heavily slanted in Gorkić's favor. Sivic and Čopić were invited to the ECCI meetings, but neither came, alleging that they hadn't gotten their visas in time. On the other hand, the other members of the Politburo were all arrested by the police during a raid in July, and thus could not attend. Although there was no proof that Gorkić was behind their arrests, tension was high, and many leftists were convinced that Gorkić had a hand in them getting caught. Either this, or that Gorkić himself was a police agent. Regardless, Gorkić's position was entrenched by the Comintern. Following the defeat of the left of the party, Stepan Sivic was sent to the United States, where he was ordered to aid in recruitment for the international brigades. While Sivic submitted to the party line, Čopić was less compliant, but he did not make his hostility to the party line public. Čopić's new assignment was to be the commander of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in Spain. By 1937, Gorkić's enemies had been scattered literally and figuratively, and he was indisputably the party leader. However, on July 3, 1937, he received a surprise letter from Moscow. It was a summoning request, or a demand rather. He informed his party. He told him that he should be back in 10 days, and then he made his trip to the Soviet Union. He did not come back. In fact, he was arrested only a month later, and then executed in November. Quite ironically, in preventing the end of Gorkić's career, Manuelski ensured the end of his life. When Gorkić was arrested and put to death, no one in the Yugoslav party was told about anything. They were left to wonder where their leader was for weeks, and the Comintern just completely stopped replying to letters from the Yugoslav communists. In Gorkić's absence, a four-way factional struggle for party leadership would open up. The struggle took place in multiple different countries and had the interference of several foreign actors. It is a Game of Thrones style story of intrigue, and it's quite interesting. It'll be the subject of my next video.